The sun beat down with an unforgiving intensity, turning the city pavement into a shimmering furnace. Sharon Donald gripped the plastic handles of her heavy grocery bags, the thin loops digging deep welts into her palms. She was beyond exhausted. Her shift as a maid had been grueling, and the trip to the mall for supplies had pushed her to her limit. Her ID badge, dangling from her neck, caught the light as she squinted at the street, looking for her agency's transport van. When a sleek private delivery van pulled to the curb, she didn't hesitate. She yanked the door open and threw her bags inside, desperate for the cool relief of air conditioning. But as the door clicked shut, the temperature didn't just drop, it froze. The interior was a sharp contrast to the bright, mundane world of grocery lists and labor she had just left behind. It was a blue-toned world of shadow, smelling of expensive leather and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder. Slumped against the far seat was K4, a man whose tailored black suit was soaked in a deep, terrifying crimson. His face was sharp and cold, even in his weakened state, and a silenced pistol lay just inches from his hand. Sharon was a maid someone paid to be invisible, to clean up messes, and to fix what was broken. K4 was a mafia boss, a man whose life was built on creating the very messes Sharon spent her life erasing. In this high-stakes moment, the sunlit world of service collided with the shadow world of the syndicate, and Sharon's decision to stay and clean a wound instead of running would change her destiny forever. The door of the van clicked shut, sealing Sharon into a world that felt cold, sharp, and dangerously quiet. The sunlight that had been punishing her moments ago was now a distant memory, replaced by the dim, blue-tinted shadows of the vehicle's interior. Her breath hitched. Sitting across from her wasn't a rideshare driver, but a man who looked like he had stepped out of a high-fashion magazine and into a nightmare. K4's tailored black suit was ruined, the silk lapel soaked through with a deep, spreading crimson that looked black in the low light. His face was a mask of pale, calculated stone, his jaw tight as he clutched a silenced pistol against his side. "Get out," he rasped, the command barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. Sharon's heart hammered against her ribs, her instinct screaming at her to bolt back into the sunlit street. But then she smelled at the metallic, unmistakable scent of iron and gunpowder clashing with the floral aroma of the laundry detergent in her grocery bag. Her eyes traveled from the gun to the wound. She had spent years being invisible, a maid who cleaned up the messes people didn't want to see, but she knew a lethal spill when she saw one. If he stayed in this van without help, he wouldn't make it to the next block. "You're bleeding out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She didn't wait for his permission. To Sharon, a body was just another environment that needed tending, and she was the best at what she did. She dropped her heavy mall bags, the plastic rustling loudly in the silent van. "Don't touch me," K4 hissed, but as the van swerved sharply, he winced, his grip on the weapon faltering. Sharon ignored him, reaching into her bag and pulling out a bottle of high-strength antiseptic cleaner and a stack of fresh, plush white towels she'd just bought for her own apartment. "I'm a maid, Mr. K4. I know how to get stains out of silk, and I know how to stop a leak. Now hold still." The irony wasn't lost on her. She was using her meager life's savings, the supplies meant for her humble home, to save a man who lived in a fortress of shadows. She doused a towel in the stinging antiseptic, the sharp chemical scent cutting through the heavy air. With the efficiency of someone used to working under pressure, she pressed the cloth firmly against his side. K4 let out a sharp, guttural growl, his knuckles turning white as he grabbed her wrist, but Sharon didn't flinch. "Pressure is the only thing that works," she murmured, her eyes meeting his cold, dark gaze. In that moment, the invisible woman and the immortal boss were bound by a cord of blood and necessity. She worked quickly, using her sewing kit to create an improvised binding, her hands moving with a grace that surprised even K4. As she secured the makeshift bandage, the van sped through the city, a private vessel of life-saving labor hidden behind tinted glass. The invisible Maid had just performed the most important cleaning job of her life. And as K4 slumped back, his breathing evening out, Sharon realized the world she was returning to would never be the same. The van didn't stop at a hospital or a clinic. Instead, it glided into the bowels of a steel and glass skyscraper, descending into a private subterranean garage where the air was thick with the scent of expensive exhaust and silence. When the doors finally slid open, Sharon was met not by doctors, but by three men in charcoal suits whose expressions were as rigid as the submachine guns tucked beneath their jackets. They didn't speak as they ushered her and the semi-conscious K4 into a private elevator. Sharon clutched her grocery bags, the plastic rustling like a frantic heartbeat against her legs. The ascent was dizzying, a silent surge that made her ears pop. And when the doors chimed open, she stepped into a world that felt entirely removed from the city below. This was the penthouse, a silent floor of marble, obsidian, and floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the rain-slicked metropolis like a god's balcony. It was beautiful, but it was a cold, lethal beauty. K4 was draped between two of his men, his head lolling back as they moved him toward a sprawling primary suite. Sharon hesitated at the threshold, her old sneakers leaving damp, faint prints on the pristine white stone. She looked down at her ID badge, the Maid, designation feeling like a joke in a place where the furniture probably cost more than her entire neighborhood. "Stay," one of the men commanded, his voice a low gravel. He didn't look at her, but his hand hovered near his holster. Sharon stood in the center of the vast living area, surrounded by the quiet hum of high-end climate control. She watched as they laid K4 on a bed draped in black silk. The transition was jarring. Hours ago, she had been scrubbing floors and worrying about a sale on laundry pods. Now, she was the only person in this gilded fortress who knew how to manage the man's injury. She realized then that she wasn't just an accidental passenger anymore. The way the guards watched the door, the way they looked at her with a mix of suspicion and necessity, it was clear she had been drafted into a different kind of service. In her old life, she was invisible because people chose not to see her. Here, she was being kept in the shadows because she knew too much. As she walked toward the bedroom to check the dressing she had applied in the van, she saw K4 stir. His eyes flickered open, catching the blue light of the city skyline. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the cold calculation in his gaze softened into a strange, haunting recognition. Sharon set her grocery bags down on a glass table, the sight of a carton of eggs and a bottle of bleach sitting next to a hand-carved jade sculpture. She wasn't just cleaning up a mess anymore. She was part of the secret. She was staff for the underworld, and as the gravity of the high-rise settled over her, she knew the silent floor would never let her go back to being just a girl in a green uniform. For the next 3 days, Sharon didn't leave the penthouse. She existed in the quiet periphery of K4's recovery, a ghost in a dark green uniform moving through a palace of glass. While his men stood like statues at the door, Sharon did what she had always done. She worked. She didn't just tend to his wound. She tended to the space around him. She polished the obsidian surfaces until they mirrored the city lights, organized the chaos of his medical supplies with surgical precision, and prepared simple, soul-warming meals that seemed out of place in a kitchen designed for show rather than sustenance. K4 watched her. From his position on the black silk sheets, his dark eyes followed her movements with a piercing intensity. To him, people were usually tools or obstacles, extensions of his will, or targets for his ambition. But Sharon was an anomaly. He watched the way she hummed softly under her breath while she worked, and the way she treated the expensive jade sculptures with the same careful respect as her own worn grocery bags. She wasn't afraid of the silence, and she wasn't impressed by the gold. On the fourth evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and stained the penthouse in hues of bruised purple and gold, Sharon was meticulously cleaning a spill near his bedside. "Why do you stay?" K4's voice was no longer a rasp. It was smooth, like velvet over steel. The doors aren't locked to you anymore. My men would have let you leave yesterday. Sharon didn't look up immediately. She finished wiping the marble, her movements methodical. A job isn't done until it's finished, she said simply, finally meeting his gaze. You were broken. I don't like leaving things broken. K4 sat up slowly, the movement no longer causing the wincing agony of the first night. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a maid who had made a mistake, but as the woman who had held his life together with a sewing kit and a plush towel. He saw the invisible strength that had allowed her to survive a life of service without becoming bitter. You spend your life fixing the world for people who don't even know your name, K4 said, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers brushing against the ID badge that hung from her neck. Sharon Donald, you are more than a shadow in someone else's house. He leaned back, the blue light of the city framing his sharp features. I live in a world where loyalty is bought and respect is taken. But you gave both for free to a man who threatened you. He paused, a rare, genuine shadow of a smile touching his lips. I'm offering you a different life, Sharon. One where you don't have to be invisible to be safe. One where you don't just clean the rooms, you own them. Sharon felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The offer was a glittering trap, a doorway into a world of lethal luxury she had only ever seen from the outside. But as she looked at K4, she realized that for the first time in her life, someone wasn't looking through her. He was looking at her. The boss's shadow was no longer just a place to hide. It was an invitation to finally be seen. The transition from the silent floor to the velvet-draped gala was like stepping from a tomb into a furnace of light. Sharon stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the crook of K4's arm. She wasn't wearing her green uniform tonight. Instead, she wore a dress of midnight silk that clung to her like a second skin, a gift from K4 that felt more like armor than attire. Beside her, K4 was a portrait of lethal elegance, his black suit tailored so perfectly it hid any trace of the bandages still beneath his shirt. Remember, K4 murmured, his voice a low vibration near her ear as they descended into the crowd. To them, you are a consultant from the West. They will try to look through you. Let them. An invisible person sees what the proud miss. The ballroom was a sea of polished masks, wealthy vipers in diamonds and silk, their smiles as sharp as the champagne flutes they held. As they moved through the throng, Sharon felt the weight of 1,000 judging eyes. These were the people she used to serve, the ones who would leave a mess on a marble table and walk away without a second thought. But tonight, she was forced to stand among them. K4 was immediately swarmed by business associates whose eyes darted towards Sharon with predatory curiosity. She played her part with a quiet, grounded intensity. While K4 navigated the treacherous waters of syndicate politics, Sharon did what she had spent years perfecting. She observed. She noticed the way a rival boss's hand trembled when he reached for a drink, a telltale sign of a man whose nerves were frayed by a failing empire. She saw the secret, sharp exchange of a ledger between a politician and a socialite in the reflection of a silver tray. While the elite were busy performing for one another, Sharon was mapping their weaknesses. You're very quiet, Ms. Donald. A woman in a gown of shimmering gold sneered, her eyes raking over Sharon with a practiced disdain. What exactly do you consult on for a man like K4? Sharon didn't flinch. She met the woman's gaze with a steady, calm clarity that seemed to unnerve her. I specialize in the things people try to hide, Sharon said, her voice smooth and professional. I see the dust under the rug that everyone else ignores. K4 caught the exchange from across the circle, a flicker of pride crossing his cold features. Later, as they stood on a secluded balcony overlooking the garden, the air was cool and smelled of jasmine and expensive tobacco. You held your own, K4 said, his expression softening as he looked at her. They think you're a mystery they can't solve. They don't know how to look at someone like me, Sharon replied, Finally letting out a breath she felt she'd been holding since they arrived. They're so busy protecting their masks that they don't realize the help is the one holding the mirror. K4 stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, shielding her from the prying eyes inside. In the glow of the garden lanterns, the polished mask he wore seemed to slip, revealing the man who had been bleeding in the back of a van. For a moment, they weren't a boss and a maid, but two hunters in a world of prey, and Sharon realized that her sharp eyes were the most dangerous weapon in the room. The luxury of the gala felt like a fever dream the moment the elevator doors opened into the cold, concrete reality of the parking garage. The transition was violent. K4 was mid-sentence, discussing the night's political gains, when a black SUV roared from the shadows of a support pillar, its tires screaming against the epoxy floor. The polished mask Sharon had worn all evening shattered as K4 grabbed her by the waist, nearly lifting her off the ground as he threw her toward the private delivery van that had started this entire odyssey. "Get in. Stay low," K4 bellowed, his voice echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. Sharon scrambled into the back, her midnight silk dress snagging on the metal floor, a jarring reminder that she was a woman of two worlds, and neither was currently safe. Before she could even find a grip, the van jolted forward. The driver, a silent man with a face of granite, floored the accelerator as a hail of bullets peppered the reinforced rear doors with a sound like rhythmic, metallic hailstones. The chase spilled out onto the rain-slicked city streets, a high-speed dance of death under the flickering neon signs. Sharon clutched the same leather bench where she had once bound K4's wounds, her groceries long gone, replaced by the weight of a man who was now shielding her with his own body. Every turn was a bone-jarring lurch. Every screech of the tires felt like a scream. Through the tinted glass, she saw the pursuing SUV pull alongside, a window rolling down to reveal the muzzle of a weapon. "They aren't just hitting a boss," K4 hissed, his eyes narrowed as he checked his own firearm. "They're hitting the man who took a nobody to the elite. They think you're my weakness, Sharon." The irony was a bitter pill. For years, Sharon had moved through this city as a ghost, ignored by the wealthy and the powerful. Now, the very people who wouldn't have looked at her twice were trying to kill her simply because she had been seen. The van swerved into a narrow alleyway, the side mirrors clipping the brick walls with a shower of sparks. The driver executed a terrifying J-turn, the vehicle spinning with a force that sent Sharon sliding across the floor. She found herself staring at her own reflection in a darkened monitor, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide, but her jaw set in that same exhausted but determined line she had carried through the mall days ago. "They found a van," Sharon gasped, realizing the rivals had tracked the specific vehicle that had rescued K4 from the initial ambush. "They're hunting the mistake. Then we make them regret finding it," K4 replied. He reached out, his hand steadying her as the van burst back onto the main thoroughfare, weaving through terrified traffic. As the sirens began to wail in the distance and the pursuit intensified, Sharon realized that the wrong van was no longer just a vehicle. It was a war zone, and the invisible Maid was now the most hunted woman in the city. The chase wasn't just about escape anymore. It was the moment Sharon realized that once the shadows find you, there's no going back to the light. The adrenaline from the chase still hummed in the air of the penthouse, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence that followed. K4 stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette a dark tear against the vibrant neon veins of the city below. He had discarded his ruined suit jacket, his white shirt stained with fresh grease and old blood, yet he had never looked more like a king. Sharon sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her midnight silk dress torn at the hem, her hands trembling as she smoothed the fabric. She was no longer just a maid who had entered the wrong van. She was the catalyst for a war she didn't understand. "They think you are a casualty of circumstance," K4 said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, resonant frequency. He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the cold blue of the skyline. They think I could be rattled by threatening what I pulled from the street. They are wrong. He didn't wait for the morning to act. By midnight, the silent floor was no longer silent. The heads of the city's sub-factions, men whose hands were stained with decades of shadow, were summoned. They stood in a semicircle in the marble foyer, their expressions a mix of suppressed rage and opportunistic curiosity. They looked at Sharon, standing just behind K4's shoulder, and their disdain was a physical weight. To them, she was a stain on the syndicate's pristine, lethal reputation, a servant who had seen the inner workings of their world. K4 stepped forward, the light catching the sharp edges of his features. He didn't offer a negotiation. He issued a decree. This woman saved the life of your leader when your own security failed. He began, his gaze sweeping the room like a scythe. Sharon Donald is no longer a witness. She is an extension of my own shadow. From this moment, she is under the unbreakable oath. To touch her is to strike at my own heart. To disrespect her is to invite your own end. A ripple of uneasy motion stirred the men. The oath was an ancient, sacred protocol, usually reserved for blood relatives or sworn brothers. To grant it to a maid, a black woman from the world of light, was an insult to their traditions. Sharon felt the shift in the room. The air grew heavy with the scent of impending betrayal. She saw the way K4's second in command, a man with a jagged scar across his temple, tightened his jaw. The unbreakable oath hadn't created a shield. It had painted a target on both their backs. As the men filed out, their bows shallow and forced, K4 turned to Sharon. The polished mask was gone, replaced by a raw, haunting sincerity. He reached out, his thumb brushing the skin just above her ID badge. "You're making them hate me," Sharon whispered, her voice cracking the stillness. "You're giving me a crown I never asked for. I am giving you the only thing that keeps people alive in this city," K4 replied, his hand lingering. "A name they are afraid to speak." But as the elevator chimed, signaling the departure of his captains, Sharon saw the flicker of a shadow in the hallway, a lingering gaze from a man who had already decided that K4's new weakness was the key to his downfall. The oath was spoken, but the war had only just begun. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, soft and golden, chasing away the harsh neon blue of the previous night. The penthouse felt strangely still. The usual hum of high-stakes tension was replaced by the faint, comforting sound of a kettle whistling in the kitchen. Sharon stood by the marble island, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She was back in a simple linen shirt and trousers, the midnight silk dress a discarded relic of a world she still didn't quite belong to. K4 entered the room with a quiet grace, his movements fluid despite the lingering stiffness in his side. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the lean strength of his forearms. He didn't approach her with the cold authority of boss, but with a cautious, almost hesitant curiosity. He took a seat at the island, watching the steam rise from her cup. "You look like you're miles away," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual lethal edge. Sharon looked out at the city, where the sunlit world of regular people was just beginning to stir. "I was just thinking about a small corner shop on 4th Street, she murmured, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "It's been empty for years. Every time I passed it on the bus to a cleaning job, I'd imagine it with a fresh coat of sage green paint. No more agency IDs. No more being a ghost in someone else's mansion." K4 leaned back, his eyes fixed on her. "A cleaning business?" "A boutique agency," Sharon corrected, her voice growing stronger as the dream took shape in the morning air. "Fair wages, proper equipment, and respect. I want to build something where the women who do the work aren't invisible. I want them to walk through the front door, not the service entrance." She laughed softly, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "It's just a dream, though. A maid's salary doesn't buy sage green paint and commercial leases. It just buys groceries and another day of being tired." K4 didn't speak for a long moment. He looked at her hands, the hands that had saved his life with his sewing kit, the hands that polished his obsidian tables with a dignity he had never seen in his own world. To him, money was a weapon, a way to exert control, or by silence. But as he listened to her, he realized it could be something else. It could be a bridge. The shop on 4th Street, K4 said, his gaze narrowing as if he were already visualizing the blueprints. It has large front windows and a brick facade, doesn't it? Sharon looked at him, surprised. You know it. I know everything in this city, he replied. He stood up, stepping into the sunlight that flooded the kitchen, the warmth hitting his face. But I didn't know the dream behind it. You spent your life tending to other people's empires, Sharon. It's time you had your own. He reached out, covering her hand with his. His touch was warm, a silent promise that felt more binding than the unbreakable oath. Consider the lease signed. Sage Gree, was it? Sharon stared at him, the sunlight and smoke of their lives finally blending into something real. In the heart of a mafia fortress, amidst the lingering scent of last night's gunsmoke, the boss had decided to fund a dream of light. And for the first time, Sharon didn't feel like a servant or a target. She felt like an architect. The fragile peace of the morning was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, unnatural silence of the penthouse's security systems. The humming of the climate control died, and the golden sunlight filtering through the glass felt abruptly like a spotlight on a stage. K4 froze, his hand still resting over Sharon's. His eyes, which had been softened by dreams of sage green paint, instantly hardened into shards of obsidian. He didn't need to check a monitor to know that the internal betrayal he had sensed was no longer a threat. It was a reality. The service elevators, K4 hissed, reaching for the weapon hidden beneath the marble counter. They've bypassed the main grid. My own men are opening the doors. Before Sharon could process the shift, the sound of breaking glass echoed from the far wing. The syndicate's coup had begun. Figures in tactical gear, led by the scarred second-in-command, swarmed the estate. They moved with the clinical precision of people who knew every camera angle and every guard rotation. But they didn't know Sharon. Down the hallway, through the pantry, Sharon grabbed K4's arm, her voice a sharp, commanding whisper. For days, while everyone had looked through her, Sharon had been learning the anatomy of the house. She knew the silent floor better than the men who guarded it, because she was the one who kept it running. She knew that the decorative wood paneling in the pantry wasn't just aesthetic. It concealed a narrow maintenance crawlway used for the plumbing and electrical conduits, a passage invisible to anyone who had never scrubbed its baseboards. They moved through the dark, cramped space, the air thick with dust and the smell of copper. Above them, the heavy boots of assassins thudded against the marble floors. Sharon led the way, her hands navigating the shadows with a familiarity born of labor. There's a junction ahead, she whispered, her heart racing against her ribs. It leads to the security substation. If we can get there, you can lock the primary suite and trap them in the foyer. K4 followed her, his breathing heavy but controlled. In the narrow darkness, the roles had completely reversed. The man who ruled the city was being led through the bowels of his own empire by the woman he had once called a ghost. When they emerged into the substation, K4 moved with lethal efficiency, his fingers flying across the backup controls. With a single keystroke, the heavy obsidian partitions slammed shut, segmenting the penthouse into a series of inescapable glass boxes. The assassins were caught in the open, their tactical advantage neutralized by the very layout they thought they understood. K4 turned to Sharon, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his eyes. He looked at her not with the pity of a protector, but with the awe of a man who had found his equal. You didn't just see the dust under the rug, Sharon, he rasped, his hand finding hers in the dark. You saw the way out. The ambush was over, broken by a maid's knowledge of the shadows. But as the sirens of loyalist reinforcements began to wail below, Sharon realized that they couldn't stay in this gilded cage anymore. The estate was a tomb of their old lives, and it was time to burn it down. The smoke from the final confrontation had long since cleared, but the air in the city felt different, lighter, as if a fever had finally broken. The silent floor was gone, liquidated along with the rest of K4's lethal assets in a transition that had sent shockwaves through the underworld. K4 had not merely survived the coup. He had used it as the catalyst to burn his old identity to ash. He was no longer the phantom of a Korean syndicate, but a man stepping into the unforgiving clarity of the sun. Sharon stood in front of the corner shop on 4th Street, her hands tucked into the pockets of a sharp, sage-green blazer. The building was no longer an empty shell of broken glass and faded dreams. The brickwork had been painstakingly restored, and the large front windows shimmered, reflecting a woman who was no longer invisible. Above the door, gold lettering caught the afternoon light, Donald and Associates. The door chimes sang as K4 stepped onto the sidewalk behind her. He looked different in the natural light. The polished mask of a mafia boss had been replaced by the relaxed elegance of a man who no longer had to look over his shoulder. He wasn't her protector anymore. He was her partner. He had provided the capital, but Sharon had provided the soul, building a legitimate empire of service that valued the hands of the workers as much as the contracts they signed. The permits for the second location were approved this morning, K4 said, standing beside her. He looked at the shop with a quiet, profound pride that mirrored her own. It seems the city likes your version of an empire better than mine. Sharon turned to him, the wind catching her hair. For years, she had been a maid entering the service entrance of life, waiting for a chance to be seen. Now, she was the CEO of her own destiny, running a business that empowered others to step out of the shadows just as she had. We built this, she corrected him softly. You gave me the keys, but I'm the one who decided where the doors would open. K4 smiled a real, unguarded expression that reached his eyes. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They were no longer bound by an unbreakable oath of blood and fear, but by a foundation of mutual respect and shared light. Behind them, the private delivery van that had started it all was gone, replaced by a fleet of professional vehicles that carried a new kind of legacy through the streets. As they walked down the sidewalk together, blending into the bustling crowd of the city, Sharon realized that the wrong van hadn't been a mistake at all. It had been the only vehicle capable of taking her exactly where she was meant to be. The maid and the boss had found their middle ground, a life where the messes were gone, the shadows were thin, and the future was finally, brilliantly their own.